Hello, book-loving friends. Today I'm going to be telling you about 8 books that I finished reading in March. And these books, 4 of them were physical books, and 4 of them were digital. Get to them later. Let's start with the physical books. I started this one last year, about August, about the same time my house started to be built, and I eventually stalled on it, and I could say the same thing about 2 other books in this pile. This is a great book if you are a Christian and you have difficult people in your life. Jesus walked away from a lot of people, and the author is Gary Thomas, a pastor in Colorado. He collected a lot of Bible verses that show when Jesus walked away, and he wrote a wonderful book here for people who just want to have peace in their life away from people who seem to be committed to not allowing them to have peace. So I recommend that book. I enjoyed it. Finished it at the beginning of March this year. I also finished this one, another book that I started last year. I think it was the third quarter of Historathon, and didn't finish it, but I finished it in March. So I'm telling you about it now. Wonderful book about the Revolutionary War. It really opened my eyes to a lot of things I did not know about before. I guess, my understanding of the Revolutionary War before reading this was pretty minimal, really. And it was nothing like what was explained in this book. So this book starts in Boston. Washington is camped west of Boston, and the British are occupying Boston. And then after that situation was resolved, they went south to the New York area, and Washington occupied New York, and eventually was run out of there by the British. Then Washington went south to New Jersey. Now, from a former video that I did, I am doing this USA road trip. And I counted the book 1776 for New Jersey because, well, I could have counted it for Massachusetts or New York, but I only can count it for one state. And the part that I read this last month was about the experience in New Jersey. Very interesting book. I'm so inspired by this book and by David McCullough's writing just in general. I have decided to read, if God wills it, I want to read every book that he wrote. And I have already read 3 of them. I read the Johnstown Flood, I read the Pioneers, and I'm not sure if that's the name of the book. Pioneers. Anyhow, the rest of them that I haven't read, I want to read them in the order in which they were written. So the next one I'm going to be reading is the Brooklyn Bridge. The Johnstown Flood was his first book, and I read that last, I think it was November, December. Wonderful, wonderful books, if you like to read about history. And the third book that was physical that I finished in March is I'd Rather Be Reading. It has books on the cover. I love books with books on the cover. So I got this book at my friend's bookstore in Wairika, California. This bookstore is right next to the Miners Inn, which is where I stayed after the fire. The fire burned my house in September 2020, and I went to a Red Cross shelter in Wairika, and because of COVID, they had us all move into hotel rooms so that we wouldn't be infecting each other with possible COVID. So I stayed in the Miners Inn for 2 months, and it was right next door to this bookstore before the bookstore opened. So I didn't actually get to go to the bookstore back then. I could look in through the windows and see that they had boxes of books that they were unpacking. Anyhow, later on, I met the man who owns the bookstore because he was assigned to help repair the trailers that we were living in after the fire. He's a trailer repairman, RV repairman, and he also owns this bookstore. So I've gone into his bookstore multiple times since then. I actually don't go to Wairika very often, but when I do, I like to stop in and see my friend, look at the books, and he also has a coffee bar in there. So it's just a wonderful experience. The name of the bookstore is McGregor's Books. And the next physical book that I finished is another Christian book, The Life Lessons from James. It is one of those write-in books that you uh, have in Bible study groups, and this is actually chosen by the Bible study group that I go to here in town. And we are still studying the last chapter of the book. We'll go on to something else. I don't know what we're going to go on to next, but this has been a really good experience. I have enjoyed reading this with the group that I meet with here in town. And so there were also 4 digital books that I finished. The first digital book I finished was the Montana book for my reading road trip, and it is A River Runs Through It. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book to anyone because although the writing was very good, I would have DNF'd it if I had not been reading it for a challenge. I would have DNF'd it because a lot of the characters and situations are really degenerate and not things that I would normally want to read about. So there's 3 stories in the book. The first one is A River Runs Through It, and I think a lot of us already know something about that because there was a movie made by Robert Redford. And the writing was so good that I was even interested in the fishing trip. I mean, the guys in the book were fishermen. They loved to go fly fishing. There were descriptions of fly fishing in the river, and really it was exciting, even though I'm not into fishing at all. So A River Runs Through It wasn't too bad, but there was a degenerate character and situations in the book. I guess it's a novella. It's a really long, short story. The second story in the book is Logging and Pimping and Your Pal Jim. And I honestly don't remember a thing about this. I didn't like it. It was extremely degenerate, things I didn't want to read about. And so I just sort of blocked it out of my memory, I guess. The third story in the book is USFS 1919, The Ranger, the Cook, and a Hole in the Sky. So I kind of liked this one because USFS, that's the United States Forest Service, it was started about the same time that this man went to the Bitterroot Mountains to work, and it was in 1919. That was the time of the story. And I think it was probably somewhat of a memoir from the life of the author. Now, the author is Norman McLean. He had a PhD, and he taught literature at the University of Chicago. And he retired and decided to write stories. And this is what we come up with. Some nice stories, excellent writing. I can't fault him on that, but some of the characters were so degenerate, I just would not have continued reading the book if it were not for me wanting to do this reading road trip. And that was my Montana book. Now, since then, I found out there is another Montana writer, or a writer that writes about Montana. It's C.J. Box, I believe is his name. And I haven't read any of his books, so I don't know if I can recommend them, but I am really kind of curious to see what he wrote. And so I was thinking maybe during June on the Range, I will try one of his books and see what that is like. Because as I understand it, they are kind of Westerns. So the next books, 3 books, were also on my reading road trip. So I will tell you the first one is a Tennessee book, and it is A Lasting Impression by Tamara Alexander, Christian fiction, historical romance. I really like those kinds of books. Usually, I haven't liked every one that I've ever read, but this one had good faith content, and it's by Tamara Alexander, is a writer I'd never read anything of before, but I liked this one so much that I am interested in reading more of her work. When I need a lightweight read, honestly, to tell you the truth, I consider these Christian fiction historical romances very lightweight. I can count on them being clean, which is one reason I like them, and had interesting characters and an interesting dilemma, so that worked for me. And so the next one that I read was an American childhood, not a Christian book, but it's by Annie Dillard. Very good writing, excellent writing style. Interesting to hear her recollections about growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I can recommend that one. It does have a chapter about her falling away from the church as a teenager, but it was kind of a strange situation because her parents would send her to church and expected her to represent the family there, but they wouldn't go themselves. So, I mean, what parent does that? I don't know. So that was my Pennsylvania book. And then the last one that I finished in March was from North Carolina. It's called The Heart of the Mountains. Now, I actually got this book as a Goodreads giveaway Kindle book. And when I got it, I realized it was actually the second book in a series, which doesn't work for me. I always want to read the first book first. So I went and got an audio copy of the first book, which was Laurel's Dream, and I read it in just a matter of days and loved it. It was a very nice, also Christian historical romance kind of book set in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. And then I started reading the Kindle book, and I found out I don't read Kindle books as fast as I read audiobooks. Unfortunately, it was another one of those books that I started last year about the time that my house was being built, and I got sidetracked and I set it aside for the longest time. Anyhow, finished it in March, loved it. The Heart of the Mountains was about a girl that came from England into the Blue Ridge Mountains where her brother was already living and her uncle was also the preacher there. So if you like Christian historical romance, I very much recommend these books by Pepper Basham. They're the only books that I've read by that author, and I know she also does contemporary Christian. I'm not all that interested in contemporary Christian books. I just like the historical romances for the most part, but I would like to read more of Pepper Basham's work, and I don't know, you might be hearing about it from me later on. She's a very talented writer, and the faith content was good. So that's it. That's all I have to share about what I read during the month of March, and I do hope that I will be able to make another video for you soon. I need to make a April TBR video next. Talk to you later.